This week, we'll talk about stimulus discrimination before moving on to stimulus generalization next week. The two topics are very much intertwined, so there will be an amount of overlap. First, let's review some terms. What is an SD or S plus? And what about an S delta or S minus? And what is stimulus control? In stimulus discrimination research, we work to find out how and if responding changes in the presence of different antecedent variables, based on those variables being paired with different schedules of reinforcement. There are a couple of schedules that are used most often in stimulus discrimination research. First, the multiple schedule. What's that one again? And how about a mixed schedule? You may wonder how a mixed schedule can be used in stimulus discrimination research if there are not, in fact, SDs associated with each schedule. In this case, responding comes under the control of the schedule of reinforcement itself, not an antecedent stimulus paired with a schedule. But that is still a form of discrimination between different conditions. So then, what is a concurrent schedule? And a conjoint schedule? When it comes down to it, stimulus discrimination research is simply a matter of assessing differential responding, in the form of different rates, magnitudes, topographies, etc., in the presence of at least two different stimuli and/or schedules. Those stimuli/schedules can be presented concurrently or in alternation. The stimuli paired with the schedules can be visual, auditory, a combination of the two, or be in absolutely any other sense mode as well. Tastes, covert stimulation produced by drugs, the passage of time, anything. Typically, stimulus discrimination research is conducted with variable interval schedules. Variable ratio schedules are very rarely used, since delivery of reinforcement is in that case directly contingent upon how fast the organism responds. Particularly during concurrent schedules, you'd almost never see the organism respond on any operandum other than the one with the densest VR schedule. In addition, responding comes under the control of ratio schedules more quickly than interval schedules, since again, the reinforcement is based directly on number of responses instead of passage of time. With interval schedules, we're more clearly and immediately able to see the effects of the antecedent variables. If we're trying to establish stimulus control such that a learner responds only in the presence of the SD and not in the presence of other stimuli, what schedules should we use during training? It's amazing the kind of considerations researchers have had to make over the years when developing this type of research. Remember from the first module that, in the first place, the organisms have to be able to perceive the stimuli to be discriminated between. Beyond that, across species, it's been found that sounds over 95 decibels are likely to be aversive. If you're trying to develop discrimination between stimuli based on schedules of reinforcement paired with those stimuli, it's not a good idea to use ones that evoke escape and avoidance. Some noises, like buzzers or bells that are manually sounded, can't be easily controlled. They may ring for longer or shorter times, or at different magnitudes depending on how loudly they're hit. As such, at least for species that have good visual acuity, single color, simple visual stimuli are often used during basic stimulus discrimination research. This does help to eliminate many extraneous variables. You'll see in the assigned reading, though, that this is certainly not always the case. Over time, different methods of assessing stimulus control have developed. Skinner started out by assessing rats' lever pressing in the presence versus absence of a light. What type of schedule would that be? During this procedure, Skinner first established steady-state responding on a fixed interval schedule without any explicitly paired SDs. What does the pattern of responding look like on that type of schedule? Once the consistent scallop pattern of responding was observed, the experimenter would start to turn on a light right before the fixed interval ended. How do you think that would begin to affect responding? Stimulus control would indeed develop. Responding would increase in rate in the presence of the light and decrease in its absence, but only slightly in this case, since there has been a history of responding coming under control of the schedule in the absence of the SD. This overall is not a great way of developing stimulus discrimination. It's more effective if schedules are paired with the different stimuli from the start. Here's a basic visualization. The rat is first trained to press the lever in the operant conditioning chamber with no particular SDs paired with the fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Then, once steady-state responding has been established, a light is turned on right before the fixed interval ends. Over time, responding will be less likely when the light is off and will increase in probability when it turns on. This moves back in time a bit from Skinner's successive method, but is more closely connected to the other stimulus discrimination methods that we'll discuss. In Thorndike's go-no-go method, we still see a multiple schedule being used, alternation between reinforcement and extinction. In this case, the SD or S+, the auditory stimulus, remains on until the target behavior occurs. Then the S delta or S minus is played, or there is silence, for an amount of time, until the SD is presented again. You can see that we can't very easily assess rate of responding in this case. It's a discrete trial method. The organism can either respond in the presence of the SD, ending the trial, or the trial goes on until that happens. Hunter updated these procedures a bit in 1914 with the go right, go left method, and we have what looks more like a concurrent schedule. In this case, the same SD is presented in two or more different locations trial by trial. Here's what that setup looks like. Two different operanda, and space for the SD to appear in different locations. This is technically a concurrent schedule, because the absence of the SD in the area of the second operandum is effectively an S delta. In 1912, the go right, go left method was further refined with a clearer commitment to a concurrent schedule of reinforcement. Yerkes, though, was still conducting discrete trial research. Here's what that looks like. In this case, the operanda are simply different colored cups on the stimulus tray. Food is always placed under the blue cup, regardless of whether that cup is on the left or right, and the proportion of trials in which the blue cup is selected are measured. Again, this means that free operant rate of response wasn't analyzed, but it could be with very slight adjustments. Like this. In this case, the two different stimuli would be paired with the availability of reinforcement versus extinction, and food would be dispensed automatically contingent on lever presses on the operandum paired with the SD. During stimulus discrimination training, particularly if you're simply assessing whether responding occurs in the presence of the SD versus stops in the presence of the S delta, overall accuracy can improve without errors being completely eliminated. Sometimes, responding in the presence of the S delta will still occur. How can that be addressed? One option functions as negative punishment in the presence of the S delta. You only switch back over to the SD if no responses have occurred for a period of time in the presence of the S delta. So, responses delay access to reinforcement. Similarly, in a discrete trial format, you could present S delta trials until no error is made. Keep in mind that an SD is very likely to become a conditioned reinforcer, since it is paired with the availability and thus delivery of reinforcement. So, if you present the SD right after an error has been made in the S delta condition, you may actually be reinforcing that error. Of course, in applied work, you likely have a punishment-based error correction procedure in place contingent upon mistakes. This all primarily applies in cases when you're alternating between reinforcement and extinction. One great way to increase accuracy more efficiently is to require what is called an observing response before the SD and/or S delta are even presented. This is very common in applied work. An instructor often says, "Look at me," before then requiring discrimination between instructional stimuli. This makes it more likely that the listener will actually perceive the stimuli. Of course, we first need to teach the observing response such that it occurs reliably, even in experimental research. Pecking an observing key is going to sometimes produce an SD, a conditioned reinforcer. But sometimes it will produce an S delta associated with no access to reinforcement. So why bother pressing that observing key? The observing response in and of itself has to be established first, maintained by intermittent reinforcement across time in the operant conditioning chamber. When concurrent schedules are used, one other concern is position preference. That is, a learner consistently uses an operandum on one side of the chamber, table, etc., regardless of whether the SD is there or not. This can develop due to adventitious reinforcement, but how can it be addressed? A common correction procedure is to present the S delta on the preferred side until a response in the presence of the non-preferred side is made. Responding in the presence of the S delta on the preferred side is extinguished, and reinforcement in the presence of the SD is actively established. Overall, do note that the session manipulation and differential reinforcement error correction procedures are preferred. If you use a punishment-based error correction, any kind of responding on one side or the other may be reduced, regardless of whether the SD or S delta are present. One more possibility you might observe: undiscriminated responding in the presence of both the SD and S delta, as well as in the absence of either stimulus. Why do you think that might happen? One possibility is that other extraneous variables are affecting the behavior. The behavior happened to be reinforced in the presence of that extraneous variable, so now that is controlling the behavior instead of the SD versus S delta. How do you think that could be addressed? You could eliminate the extraneous variable if at all possible, perhaps by playing a white noise or darkening the lab environment outside of the operant conditioning chamber. You could also move the experiment to a brand new environment that is presumably more controlled. Ultimately, the questions asked and hopefully answered during stimulus discrimination research may come down to: what are the conditions necessary for stimuli to acquire control of a learner's behavior? And, while we do typically start out in controlled environments, how is stimulus control established in the natural environment?